Hello, everybody. I'll just give a few minutes just for people to join. Excellent. Well, let's kick off. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Economic Research Council webinar this evening on local economic impacts of COVID-19. I'm delighted that you could all join us for what's going to be a very interesting talk. Amy Allen, who I would like to thank for coordinating and setting this up, is from the Economic Research Council, and she will have sent you an email, I think, telling you about the Zoom call itself. So we've actually got everybody switched off in terms of camera and mic, but we would very much encourage you to use the Q&A button to raise questions, and I'm going to chair the meeting. My name's Jacque Mallender, and I'm on the Executive Committee of the Economic Research Council, and I'll try and curate as best I can the questions for the panel. We have two guest speakers tonight from Cambridge Econometrics. Ben Gardiner, who's an experienced economist and a director at Cambridge Econometrics. His focus is on regions, cities and local area teams. And we have Chris Thoung, who is also an experienced economist and public policy researcher from Cambridge Econometrics, and he is oversight of the economics of social policy, health and social care, and also inequality and poverty at Cambridge Econometrics. And tonight they're going to be talking about three aspects of the economic impact of COVID-19 from a local point of view. So this is taking it, rather than looking at it from a macroeconomic perspective, looking at it from a local perspective, particularly around economic exposure, impact, and recovery and resilience. And basically how ready and likely we are to bounce back this year. So then I'm going to hand over to Chris. I think he's going to speak for about 40 minutes with Ben, and we're going to leave the last 20 minutes for questions. Please feel free to raise your questions during the presentation, and as I said, I will try and sort out the questions and group them together and put them to Chris and Ben at the end of the session. So again, thank you very much for joining us, and I'm now going to hand over to Chris.
Great, thanks, Jacque. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, Cambridge Econometrics is a consultancy. We've been around for about 40 years now, originally as a spin-off from the University of Cambridge, and specifically the Department of Applied Economics there, and the work of Professor Sir Richard Stone, who set up the Cambridge Growth Project. But that was quite a long time ago now. So what we are today is really a private but independent economics consultancy, majority owned by a charitable trust. And our work, which is really what we're here to talk to you about today, is really economic analysis for public policy, which we've been doing for quite a long time now. As Jacque mentioned, the topic that we're here to speak about this evening is the local impacts of COVID-19. And I mean, we're seeing a lot of the impacts in the media already. A lot of the focus has been at a national level, and the reason we've taken an interest in local impact is because place obviously matters, but also particularly some of the things that Ben's going to show you. How things look at a place-based level is more than just scaling everything up or down to look at individual areas. There's a lot more going on. There's a lot more variation. So the way we've always approached this is you need to think slightly differently about those local impacts, and in what is I suppose a very live situation right now, you need to be thinking about this in a lot of different ways. So what we'll cover today is potential economic exposure, which was really how do you need to start thinking about this before you have much hard data to look at what's going on, extending to wider impacts, how that might be transmitted elsewhere through the economy and other parts of the country. And then after that, which I think is going to fast become the exam question, is what does that mean for a possible recovery? What can we learn about regional resilience from previous events over the last few decades? So just very briefly to recap the macro picture, because I think it's difficult to really get into the local detail without that. I mean, where we are at the moment is we're in a lockdown that was a deliberate attempt to reduce and avoid spread of the virus. So the reductions in economic activity follow as a known consequence of that. That's what's happening right now. And at least to economists, we'd normally think of that as a mix of supply and demand effects. So on the supply side, we're talking about a lockdown that affects the productive capacity of the economy. People can't work, not everyone can work from home. And certainly for those who either fall sick or have caring responsibilities, their ability to work is going to be impaired, as many of you will be experiencing, and just a general change in working conditions as well, which may affect productivity. And then on the demand side, through this we get reductions in income, so people aren't able to spend or are more reluctant to spend because of the uncertainty, but also because we are shutting down large parts of the economy, there's also just an inability to spend as well. And this is certainly a challenge anyway, but becomes much more of a problem if we need a sustained lockdown to try and contain the virus, and for health reasons ultimately, because the longer it happens, the more we see falling incomes, more businesses become prone to problems with cash flow and solvency, and these sorts of effects just become much harder to reverse as time goes on, which is the concern. This is what economists call scarring, and this is to a large degree where the role for government intervention and various policies have come in over the last few months. And that's really the broad economics of it. And the challenge for economists is that for really crisis situations, as we found in the financial crisis as well, data are very slow moving. It takes us some time to really see these effects in the data, even though you can see them in the media, and I suppose what Denny Blanchflower would call the economics of walking around as well. So we need other ways to be thinking about this. Some of that's through short-term indicators. So financial markets are a very good barometer, at least, of people's expectations about how the economy is doing. We have surveys as well, so business surveys, but also new surveys that the Office for National Statistics has been commissioning over this period to try and look specifically at the problem. And I suppose just following on from the excitement about big data, there's also just alternative data sources. So there were articles about Open Table and how bookings for restaurants were falling off a cliff. We can look at job sites, so various operational data sets to look at job vacancies. We can look at passenger traffic. There are other ways we can start to monitor these things as proxies for what's going on in how we normally think of the economy. But certainly in the early stages, and to a certain degree where we still kind of are, is we have to be informed and we have to develop our assumptions and views based on historical experience and forecasts and scenarios, which will be progressively revised as new information comes in. And that's really exactly what has been happening in terms of the forecasts right now. So what you see here are just the forecasts for UK GDP for 2020, set up in chronological order. So the very first forecasts that I'm showing you here were from the International Monetary Fund and the Office for Budget Responsibility around the middle of April, with the Bank of England following not long after in early May, right up to the OECD's forecast from last week. And I mean, to be fair to both the OBR and the Bank of England, these were presented more as scenarios rather than forecasts, but judging by where things are headed according to the OECD forecast and where the data seem to be going, if these are indeed explorations of more extreme outcomes, these extreme outcomes are starting to look more and more likely. So the prospects for the UK look increasingly pessimistic as time goes on. What was thought to be weak growth in 2020 is fast looking to be at least low double-digit contractions in growth for the year, with unemployment very likely to rise not long after. And that's where we're, that's what we're starting to think and start to see in terms of where the economy might be headed. And this is this is showing up in the economic data, or at least it's just starting to, from the ONS last week, with some very sharp falls in activity, I would say, in some pretty unsurprising places like accommodation and food services, which is, there's hotels and restaurants and so on. And the only other thing to note, just because it came out yesterday, is that we're not yet seeing an increase in unemployment in the headline figures, but it is starting to look like it's coming, because we see increases in the number of benefits claims. And this is to do a little bit with how the furlough scheme just works anyway, but also just the way the claimant count has been changing over time, not least because of universal credit, but more recently because part of the COVID response has been to extend eligibility for benefits claims. But it's, at the moment, it's very hard to see unemployment not rising fairly soon. So that's the macro picture as far as how economists have been tracing the forecasts so far, and how that unfortunately seems to be bearing out in the economic data. I'm going to hand over to Ben now, who's going to talk a little bit about how turning that national picture into a local picture isn't as straightforward as it may first seem.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so you've already seen some macro results and the most recent macro sector results. And also, kind of in the last month or so, there have been various attempts at doing some localization of the kind of results or forecasts of the COVID impact for the current year. And a lot of these, or most of them so far, have really been effectively taking these national sector results and boiling them down to local level. So assuming that every sector within a local area or region behaves the same way on average as the country does, and then what comes out of that is a kind of average local area or regional results. And it's easy to see why this might be the case in terms of the availability of the macro sector results that come out initially. The data's better. It's hard to get the local data. And of course, early on, we had the OBR reference scenario, which Chris mentioned, and which I've included here on the right-hand side table, which was used by several organizations around to push out these results early on and say such and such a place is going to come off worst, such and such a place is least likely to be affected. Interesting, and just to point out on the OBR one, you can see that the only positive sector that was assumed at this point, because it wasn't really a model forecast, it was really kind of collective set of assumptions, was health and social activities, which was assumed to grow by or be 50% better than the baseline. Contrast that to Chris's slide, the number on Chris's slide, where it was still negative. So clearly something hasn't, quite happened the way we expected it to, and that in itself will also feed through into these kind of results. So anyway, it is a seemingly, as I say, seemingly seductive approach to take these national sector results and just simply push them down to whatever spatial level you require to happen. But there are some risks in doing this, and I was interested in a little mini exercise of just seeing what happened if you do this. Chris, you can pass the next slide. And the exercise was really to say, well, what if we actually knew from a previous recession what the macro sector results were, and also what the outcomes were for local areas, regions, and so on. And of course, we do know that. We do have that information from the most recent Great Recession, 2008, 2009. So what would actually happen if you took the results at the national sector level, which we did for 45 sectors that we cover in our own database, for output and employment, and take these and apply them in the same way that everyone else, other people have done, to different spatial levels, what comes out of that versus what actually happened. So you get a projected and an actual result. And this is, for those of you that know this kind of work, very much like a shift chair approach, where you're basically covering the macro and the sectoral mix part of the analysis, but largely ignoring anything to do with local competitiveness and local impact effects. So if we basically come across to the slides, I can show you kind of the results of this. Chris, I'll move on to the next slide here. So this is basically what you get when you move down spatial levels. So you have 3 spatial levels: NUTS 1, which is the standard planning regions, for those that remember those, before regions became a kind of dirty word. NUTS 2, which is kind of smaller regions, kind of groups of counties, and then local authority districts, where you move into kind of almost 400 individual observations, one for each area. So each dot represents where a region or local area ended up over the 2008-2009 period in terms of its growth, and where versus where the top-down method would get you if you applied that, given what you knew. And you can see, generally speaking, that the position, although it doesn't start from an amazing place, but it gets progressively worse the lower the spatial level you get to. Perhaps that shouldn't be a surprise, because the lower the spatial level you go to, the more there are specific characteristics of local areas that are important in determining local outcomes. And so from a NUTS 1 or a standard planning region perspective, you can potentially predict a bit more, and as you go down to local authority, a lot less. Also, on the employment side, the predictive ability of the top-down method is really a lot worse, which again, has implications for when people start looking at labour markets and kind of skills outcomes and so on and so forth. And certainly it's the case that employment outcomes are more nuanced than output outcomes. There's more going on in the labour market that might determine what actually you observe compared to the kind of GVA or output results from individual firms. We also did some a bit of analysis looking at the previous recession in '91, because what you tend to find over time, certainly since the 90s to the 2000s, is that sectoral structure across areas in Britain has become a lot more similar, with the rise of service sector, decline in manufacturing. And simply from a sector perspective, because places look more similar on that kind of profiling, then that top-down method will then become less useful, because all areas will behave the same way. And yet they don't. Why don't they? Well, that's because of other features of the economy which make them behave differently from that top-down method. So these are the kind of main findings I had from this little exercise. So next slide, Chris. And so just to point out finally, before I hand over to Chris, in case he's worrying, I was going to carry on. So this really points out the need to look at things from a local perspective, and also to move a bit beyond just the sectoral profile of an area to understand how vulnerable or how exposed it is. So at this point, I'll shut up and I'll hand over to Chris, who'll carry on.
Thanks. So what we've taken you through so far is that we have an emerging macro picture at the moment. It's still, I mean, at least in crisis terms, a bit out of date insofar as a lot of the data that are coming through are at least a few weeks old, if not a month plus old. But we're starting to see at least the impact of what was happening in the first half of what I think has been a 13 or 14 week lockdown so far. And then alongside that, Ben's been talking about why we just do need to think more carefully about the local economic impacts as being something arguably a bit different from just finding ways to disaggregate the macroeconomic picture. So this next set of slides is really playing back a few things that we were doing. It must have been about the middle of April, when there weren't much data going around, and it wasn't so much of a question of where are the impacts falling, but where might the impacts fall in the event of a prolonged lockdown. So that was kind of the question that we were considering when we were looking at economic exposure. And a lot of this stems largely from how government policy might play out at a local level. So we have a lockdown in place that puts restrictions on who can leave their homes, whether to work or at the time to go out and exercise and so forth. And on the basis of that, we then started to ask, well, which industries is that likely to particularly fall on? And at a local level, because different areas have different economic compositions, how might that look if there are areas that are particularly reliant on some of these industries compared to others? That's what we were looking at here. Where might the lockdown bite in economic terms most forcefully? And the first part that we looked at then was just simply which are the jobs, or how many jobs in these areas might be affected by lockdowns. And we looked at a handful of sectors, but just in the interests of time and brevity, the slide pack is available on the company website if you want more of the detail. But if we were to take tourism and leisure, for example, which comprises industries like hotels and catering, accommodation, but also various recreational services as well. And in this case, we also included air transport within our definition. What we were looking at was which of these areas has particularly high shares of jobs that are in these industries, because if these are industries where lockdown is most likely to lead to sharp reductions in economic activity, then these are areas where, at least in proportionate terms, you would think that there'd be greater economic impacts to that economy. And looking specifically at tourism and leisure, we found that in most cases, the share of jobs that were in these sorts of industries was between 10 and 20%. But we did find a few areas where that share was quite a bit higher, and these are the ones that you see put up on the map here with a few labels. But I mean, you don't need to look at those too closely. I think what starts to come through, if you're familiar with the economic geography of certainly Great Britain as it is in this map, is that where you see particular impacts are in tourist areas like the southwest around Cornwall and the coast, up in Cumbria, again another place where UK holidaymakers like to go, and then a few coastal areas as well. And that is largely explained by jobs in industries that involve running hotels, restaurants and catering, and is of still continued concern, because this was when we were looking at this back in April, but even then the tourist season, particularly for these sorts of areas, was still to come as well. So there's a question about how a gradual relaxation of the lockdown, if it continues along this path, might occur in a way that may or may not lead to the most visible losses from tourism still to occur. And the other areas of note in this analysis were Crawley and Hounslow, which is where Gatwick and Heathrow airports are based as well. And this is largely because we included air transport in our definition of tourism and leisure here. I don't think that's overly surprising. Crawley in particular has become a bit of a worrisome case in that respect, because you'll see that there are increasing numbers of papers and analyses that take a similar approach to what you see in front of you right now. And some of the definitions can differ, some of the approaches can differ slightly, but in a lot of these cases, Crawley is consistently at the top or near the top of these kinds of impact rankings for that reason. And I think is also starting to play out a bit insofar as Virgin Atlantic announced, I think at the beginning of May, that it was going to be pulling operations out of Gatwick. And the last I heard, British Airways was still considering it, though perhaps hadn't acted on anything just yet. So I think this is, at least in some of these cases, these are areas that we identified as potential hotspots that I think at the moment still seems quite reasonable an assessment, at least 6 weeks or so on. So that's from a sectoral point of view, but there are various other ways of thinking about the structure of a local economy. And the other way that's gaining increasing traction, originally from the automation debate, is if you start to look at the breakdown of occupations, so managers as distinct from what are called elementary occupations or trade skills. And what you have here, and you don't need to look at the full detail of this because I'll talk you through the key points, is that using a similar approach to Jonathan Dingle and Brent Neiman in the US at the University of Chicago, we've identified occupations that, at least from, let's say, from a broadly automated perspective, can be thought of as either plausibly worked from home or not. That's the distinction that we've generated here, and we've applied it to UK employment data broken down by industry and occupation to try and understand not so much from how does a lockdown prevent certain industries from continuing to operate, but just more from a bottom-up perspective. If the rule was you have to work from home if you can, to what extent is that possible, differentiated by different industries and occupations? And the first part that it's worth pointing out is that in accommodation and food services and construction, by this measure, which I would stress is still an indicative analysis because of the way it's being constructed, 70% of the jobs in these industries don't look like they could be worked from home, with wholesale, retail and motor trades and manufacturing not too far behind. I'm not going to dwell on agriculture because it's relatively small in employment terms at about 350,000 jobs, I think was the last number I was looking at. Whereas in contrast, accommodation and food services, 70% not able to work from home is almost 2 million employees. Wholesale and retail is about 3 million. I think construction might be 1, and from what I have here, manufacturing is 1.5 million. So there's, across these 4 industries alone, that's about 7.5 million jobs, which is roughly a quarter of the workforce. So this is really where, if you can't work from home, these are the kinds of industries where that problem is most concentrated in a lockdown. And you end up with a bit of a kaleidoscope, but things to note are that a lot of those jobs in accommodation and food services are among what are classified as elementary occupations in UK statistics, whereas in construction, they're more skilled trades and occupations, and wholesale and retail is more sales and customer service occupations. That's where you find people who are less likely to be able to work from home. And socioeconomically speaking, these jobs tend to be somewhat lower paid compared to other occupations in the classification. So these are people who can't work from home, and that might represent quite a significant income loss to them. It's not shown in these slides, but there is a mirror image version of this that shows who can work from home, and it really shows the reverse of what you see here, with those working in information communication, various professional financial services, and education. Although I would take that with a pinch of salt. These are professions where people are more likely to be able to work from home, but also where those who can work from home are more likely to be in senior or professional occupations. So they can work from home and they're relatively well paid as well. So I think this is again starting to bear out in the news reports and at least some of the data that we're starting to see as well. So, this is increasingly common at a national level, but at least to Ben and my knowledge is relatively rare at a regional level, which is what we've done here. Really applying the same kinds of principles, but looking at the individual local areas around the country, in this case, travel to work areas. So on the left-hand side is our assessment of areas in which there are 60% of people or more who, by our measure, couldn't work from home. And you see that where this is more of a problem is in coastal areas of England, and then some fairly significant areas in Scotland and Wales as well. And we did redo the kind of analysis that Ben alluded to before about just simply scaling down the impacts, which is what you see here if we take the OBR kinds of assessment and apply it at a local level. And I think the takeaway here is that you do get some very different pictures, but as we're learning about this as it goes on, and at least what we're getting from the data and talking to clients is that these different angles shedding light on different parts of the problem. And it's not to say that one of these is necessarily better than the other, but it points to the idea that if you're not looking at things in different ways, you could get stuck on a particular view or conception of how the impacts are going to fall. Whereas at least by this, we can start to introduce some nuance. We can, at the very least, start to talk about, well, if it's more dominant in these sorts of industries, or if we're thinking about this sort of effect, we can at least, I suppose, put forward the usual many-handed economist sort of explanation about what you at least need to consider as you're navigating this. And so that's kind of where we're getting to with this. And as I say, this is a very live situation in terms of the data coming through. So we have started to look at information that came through, say, on Friday or yesterday even, in terms of where the take-up has been in terms of furloughing and self-employment. And it's difficult to definitively confirm any of these views at the moment, but at least from a furloughing perspective, we've found some overlap between what we identified as possible areas of vulnerability, at least in tourism, relative to where furloughing appears to be somewhat higher. There are other areas that are also being affected, but probably because they're being hit in other industries that we haven't yet been able to consider in the analysis that we've done so far. And then at the other end, we are seeing somewhat lower take up in places like Oxford and Cambridge, which I think is confirming to some extent the sectoral breakdown. But my guess at the moment is that that would also be reinforced by the occupational structure as well. And in terms of how we think about this going forward, that's something that I'd certainly like to be exploring further in the coming weeks. So the analysis that we have so far is not entirely inconsistent with the data that's coming through. I mean, there's a lot of complexity there that I think we'd be hard pressed to fully account for at the moment, especially as the data are coming in fast. But we're I think we've found so far that this has been a reasonably useful way of at least thinking about that exposure. And just in terms of filtering the areas for where you might need to look hardest, I think it's still proven its value. And just very quickly, there is information on self-employment income support, but actually the data suggests that's just generally a very widespread problem across the country. So about 70%, at least according to HMRC's estimates, 70% of the eligible population is making use of the scheme right now. But the variation across the country is actually very narrow. It's maybe a couple of percentage points either side of that. So the regional angle there is less clear, but at the same time, with uptake that's as high as that, I think is quite clearly just a general problem anyway. So that's where we are on potential economic exposure, and I'll just leave Ben now to talk us through the final parts about wider impacts and what that might mean for resilience and recovery.
Thanks, Chris. So what Chris has portrayed well there is the aspect of vulnerability and how we're starting to build up a picture of local impacts. And what I'm going to do for the next couple of slides is really just show how an example of what we've done already, where you say, okay, we've got some direct effects in a local area. So you're boiling down into a cohesive area, whether it's a local authority jurisdiction or combined local authority, and saying how do you then estimate estimate the wider impacts. And so those initial effects can generate what's called the direct impacts, where you've got particular kind of industries that you estimate the kind of immediate effects. And effectively what you can do is use input-output analysis to calculate the wider indirect impacts, and if you have a slightly more sophisticated model, the induced impacts as well. And a classic example of that, which Chris has already mentioned, is in the tourism or hospitality sector, where you've got the direct effects on spending, which go through into either turnover or employment losses, the indirect effects as that feeds through supply chains into food and drink sectors and other local marketing sectors, and then an induced effect is that lack of spending power then circulates back through the economy into other sectors that people might spend their money on. This is just kind of, next slide is really just kind of showing some work that we've done for a combined local authority to give an idea of the scale of these effects using our own local economy forecasting model. Now, these have their use for these kind of purposes. They're still limited in some ways, as Chris was saying. The COVID shock is almost immediately both a supply and a demand shock, and traditionally the input-output models are much more suited towards the demand side than the supply side. So effects on kind of firms going out of business, restrictions on supply chains are a lot more difficult to pick up on than the more straightforward kind of demand channels that go through local economies. It's also important when you're doing this analysis that the direct impacts are purely direct impacts and not indirect effects themselves. So if you're picking up an effect on the food and drink sector and you think, hang on, that's an effect caused by the pub sector or the restaurant sector, then you're going to be double counting if you count that initially as a direct effect. So what we needed in this example was an estimate of the direct effects, which we received from the client, put it through the input-output structure of the model, allowed for additional effects on certain degree of occupational variability in the area, and also adjusting for labour force participation to do with population changes. And these are the overall results that you get out. So the indirect effects, which comprise also the other effects apart from the direct ones, which comprise the indirect and induced effects, approximately about 25% of the overall impact. And these are spread across the different sectors. And interestingly, again, come back to the government services sector, which was assumed to be positive by the client in terms of direct impacts, whether, I can't remember whether this was due to kind of following OBR or whether just estimating and assuming that the effects on kind of health services would be positive. But the overall effect caused by the indirect and induced impacts was negative because that's spread across all sectors. That's a kind of overall kind of economy-wide effect, and you can effectively do this for any sector, any local economy put through the system. Right, I better move on into further slides. Time's ticking on. So last main section on this was really to talk about thoughts on resilience prospects for recovery. We've done some work on resilience, both ourselves with Cambridge University. So I was just reporting back a little bit on what we observed from this and what we found from previous work, previous recessions and so on. So the three bits are going to be, what do we mean by resilience? Because sometimes for some people it's not a familiar topic. What have we learned from previous work, and how do we take this on board going forward? So next slide, Chris, please. So resilience is basically three components. So it's how you resist the shock, which is very much related to how vulnerable you are to the shock as well, which Chris has already talked about, so I'm not going to focus on that too much here. And then second and third, how you potentially react, reorientate your economy, and how you recover from this. And people may think, oh, well, it's not really important. There's just a kind of bounce back to kind of normal following any shock. And this is, in a way, the standard approach that's sometimes even built in to economic models in the way that they behave around shocks. And we've probably seen many macro models from the more established international organizations which do just that, for the very reasons that these are built into the structures of the model, so you don't get the effect. But it's also true that if you actually look at the data and look at the effects of previous research, that the actual long-run path of regions and areas is actually built up from this continuous process of shock, recovery, resistance, and so on. And so the shocks help shape the long-run path of the economies. And there is, when you look at the evidence, no automatic return, no kind of Friedman plucking model, which is, if you look at the kind of stylized chart on the right-hand side, the kind of the A, B, C, D, E, the standard kind of approach where you kind of pluck a string, it vibrates, and you come back to normal. Our research on cities and towns in the UK has shown that the majority of areas in the last recession actually followed the G path, so A, B, C, G. So they recorded a lower trajectory following the shock, and the majority of the other areas follow the F path. So they don't come back to a normal level, a previous level of output. So you've got a permanent loss. So the study of resilience and why regions behave like this and what can be done to improve their resistance is incredibly important, and certainly as we're in the middle of or about to suffer from the recession and think about the recovery. The next slide, please. So what can we learn from previous work in this area? Well, as we've talked about already, sectoral structure has been a focus of research to ask the question, how relevant, how important is sectoral structure in determining the resilience of areas to shocks? And largely speaking, as with the top-down method, it's not overly important. There's big debates about specialization versus diversification, whether being specialized in one sector is more important or whether a more diversified portfolio approach is better. And on the whole, the diversification argument is generally winning the ground on that one. Also, the embeddedness of local supply chains is seen as also quite an important aspect of being resilient to external shocks. I'm not going to go into these too much more because time is pushing on, but we can happily take questions. And a few other features that are seen as important. Well, I've already talked about the lack of bounce back to previous trajectories. Often it's the areas that are least resistant or resilient to start with from previous shocks that are then further least resilient down the line following the next shock. So these effects of lack of resilience compound over time and also built upon slow burn effects. So if there's a long-going shock of deindustrialization, a long-going shock of low wage growth industries in an area, this all adds up to being a less resilient area, which is a big aspect, or will be a big aspect of being able to achieve anything on the levelling up agenda once the effects of these shocks come through in the recovery. The chart on the right just throws in some further ideas about the nature of the shock and the type of recovery and resilience which will occur depending on how deep the shock is and how long the shock lasts. And obviously, if it's the logic being, if there's a very short and shallow shock, then you could well get a bounce back to normal recovery paths. But the longer the shock goes on and the deeper the shock, the more things will change, the more firms will shut, there'll be more supply shocks going on. And so you'll emerge into more of a transformational type scenario with the whole economy having to change its structure if there's a prolonged shock, which it could well be the case with the COVID if there's a second wave and people adjust very slowly in their behavior to returning to what we thought of as was normal. Okay, next slide.
And I
quickly.
think we do need to leave some time for some questions.
Yes,
So.
yeah. I will skirt over this one very quickly. Other aspects apart from sectors which are seen as important are both kind of labour market structures, whether you've the type of occupations that are in an economy, as Chris has alluded to, gender, part-time versus full-time. Also, the type of business structures in local areas and regions. Access to finance is an important area that hasn't been discussed so much, whether finance capital from London will move away from riskier places kind of north of the greater southeast and retrench back to London where they're more familiar with. So this could affect ability of more vulnerable places to recover. And very importantly, the governance structure, the importance of national down to local networks, and a whole builds into the whole devolution argument about transferring power down from central government to local government. The final thing to say on this really is that the whole resilience aspect is not a short-term fix. It's something that really needs to be built into local policy making, local industrial strategies, which hasn't really been there up to now, and needs to form part of any coherent recovery strategy. This largely, conclusions are very quick. It's a very uncertain picture so far. Data are still emerging. We know that a top-down picture is a very partial picture of what happens, and you need to look at the local levels and local heterogeneity characteristics to understand things better and build up a narrative of how things will happen. And we also know that understanding what drives resilience and the importance of local policy making will be critical in allowing the recovery to fully take place in areas, and also allow the levelling up agenda to continue. I'll stop there to allow some time.
Thank you so much, Chris and Ben. That was incredibly fascinating, if not a little scary. We've been having some questions come through on the chat. So if there's some sort of policy implications, I think, from some of the questions, but I'd like to first just focus a little bit on the technical ones. The first question is from Sandy, wanting to know whether some of the recent job cuts, which are very specific to industry and reference the hospitality sector in particular, are you taking those into account as they come through on the local impacts modelling? So these are Rolls-Royce and also some of the hospitality cuts we heard about in this last week.
No, is the short answer right now. They're coming quite thick and fast, and it's a bit difficult to locate some of them at a local level as well. So that's not the plan at the moment, at least in terms of the cross area analysis. I imagine if we needed to look at specific areas, it would come into scope very quickly, though.
Yeah, for a local area impact analysis, I mean, you could do that if you were looking at the kind of Derbyshire, kind of either county, combined authority, whatever, for the kind of looking at those effects. You could trace those through supply chains and do the same kind of impact multiplier analysis to come up with a gross effect. So it's possible, but the area we covered wasn't involving that.
And what about in terms of some of the other indicators? Are you looking at the impact on property prices? There's been a lot of discussion about the shift from cities to rural. Is that something that you take into account in the model? Sorry, that question was from Jeff Beacon.
At the moment, it's not been our immediate priority. I think it's a good question to start asking, but just in terms of what we've been driven to look at as a priority, I can't tell you that we've looked at it yet. And
then there's a couple more technical ones about looking at the similar historic comparisons of how well national occupation-based impacts can predict outcomes at local level. Have you done this for sort of tried to replicate it for previous periods of time?
Again, not as yet. I think what Ben has been doing on the comparative analysis is probably the only work we've done to look back at past recessions. But if you look back even to the last 2 or 3, even at a macro level, they have been quite different. I mean, one of the things that struck me when Ben was talking about certainly the financial crisis was that the employment response was relatively muted anyway compared to the 1990s recession. So there's a lot more that we'd need to think quite carefully about before we do a full comparative exercise.
Yeah.
I'm really bad at this. That's from Colin Edwards, by the way.
Just to follow up on that about specific sectors as well came to mind, which I didn't quite mention. I mean, despite our criticism of the top-down approach, there is an argument that some of the effects we're seeing from the shocks are quite sector-specific, and they are national. You know, whole sectors are or have been closing down in the sense of restaurants, pubs, high street retail. And so, at least initially, until things are starting to return to normal and shops reopen and pubs and restaurants and so on get back to normal, you might well see kind of in the early statistics a top-down approach working quite well because of the nature of the shock. And it's often the nature of the shock which determines the initial impact and effects that you see in the data. What then happens subsequently and how those effects manifest themselves into consumer spending and so on is perhaps a different thing altogether and is more predictable in the way that recessions work their way through economies.
On that note, Preetam Domar had a point to make about the potential productivity impacts. I mean, lots of discussions about productivity not having gone down when people have been working shorter weeks or working on furlough 4 days a week or.
Yeah, well, if you thought in my slides employment and output were difficult enough, if you look at the ratio of the two and see what happens to labour productivity, there wasn't room on the slide to show that as well. But for labour productivity, the top down is practically meaningless, whatever level you do. I mean, there's just so many things going on with both the output movement and employment movement. So, from a simple mechanical perspective, using the top-down approach to try and predict productivity is a non-starter, I think. We're currently doing some research to look at the productivity effects of the pandemic for the Productivity Insights Network. I think there's going to be a book out sometime in the early autumn on that, covering a whole range of different aspects of the economy. So, I mean, it's an interesting one as well, because the last recession was really a step change in the way that productivity recovered, or rather didn't recover, from when you compare it against previous recessions. Usually there was a shock down, and then there was a recovery path back to some kind of trend. But for the most recent recession, that didn't happen at all, and we're nowhere near any kind of previous trend. So clearly there's been a step change, as we know, in the labour market conditions and the employment growth that has led to productivity looking a very different animal to what it was pre-Great Recession. And the big question is whether that another shock to productivity will drive that lower, as the emphasis is to get people back into work after furloughing, and there's less investment going on from firms as they hold back with the uncertainty, with Brexit compounding things as well. I've seen a question on that. So there's a whole storm out there that could lower productivity even further.
I mean, I'm kind of hopeful but not hopeful that we'll get time to talk about Brexit, but the most controversial part of this aspect. But there is a very serious question about, and several participants have raised it, Mike and Sandy and others, about how we actually should strategically manage the way out of this. I mean, what can Rishi Sunak do compared to local authorities? You know, is more devolution going to be a better way of dealing with the locally driven multipliers that we're seeing in your models? That's probably a bit beyond your brief, but be very grateful to hear your thoughts on that.
I think there's two parts to this. There's obviously the national government can help with national problems, and where there are widespread sector losses across the country, then and kind of widespread kind of issues about tourism and so on, then for sure national government can and should and is starting to play a role with the furloughing schemes, the self-employment support schemes, and these are great and much needed, but they're still kind of holding back the flood, as it were, that will eventually happen. And so you also need the kind of business support schemes, the loan schemes, to kind of tide them over for this initial period until they can start to get back on their feet. But then as well, compounding that, you've got, as we've shown by the fact that the local characteristics, the lower the level you go, are very important as well. So you also need that balance between the national and the local. And this is where having more power at devolved levels, I think, is of critical importance. And I don't think it can come quickly enough. But you also need that capacity as well at local level. It's not just a case of dumping everything onto local government and saying get on with it. It's a very unfair thing to do and expect them to kind of pick up the pieces where the national government's left over.
Yeah, I think that's right. And just to add to that, even before COVID-19, it was Brexit that stalled some of this devolution as well. And local authorities were left in a little bit of a halfway house as business rates were slowly devolved to them. So the process of providing them with the resources is still a question that hasn't been properly answered yet.
And have you done any modelling of the potential impact of different Brexit scenarios, including a no deal? Have you laid that on top of this?
I'm looking to Ben.
Well, we have done pre-COVID. We have done Brexit work analysis on a variety of flavours. Although with many kind of forecasting type consultancies, we were tending to see no deal as more of an outlier, whereas now it's starting to become very much more centre stage. So we are actually in the process of kind of looking again at our forecasts with expecting to get something out later in the summer, which will have to combine the kind of very uncertain effects of COVID-19 with probably a harder Brexit as a mainstream scenario. Just to add to this, I mean, I think, you know, we need, as economists, need to be very humble about what we can do in these respects, because a lot of it relates to behavior of people, and economists have been traditionally incredibly bad at predicting behavior and how people react. And we're assuming rational actions and things, and clearly it's not the case for that. So this is an example where I think the role for scenarios and playing out different lengths and depths of the shock alongside each other is almost as important, if not more important, than just doing forecasting and saying here's your decimal point accuracy, which we know is so far off.
Well, look, I'm very conscious of the time. We have 1 minute, a 1 minute question or answer to the question. Any thoughts on labour subsidies targeted at the lower paid? That was from Jeff Beacon. You haven't got 1 minute to think of an answer. You have to give it in 1 minute.
I mean, there's still been this long-standing problem about any work is not necessarily enough anymore. It's just a prevalence of low paid work, and I think that's only something that has shifted compared to previously, where work was a much clearer way out of poverty and supporting households. So I certainly wouldn't want to rule out that part of the debate at this point, just because of how the labour markets are clearly shifting to work doesn't guarantee good income anymore.
Well, before we actually get shut, I'm going to say a big thank you, Chris and Ben. It is a heroic effort to try and model the impact of this pandemic anyway, and to try and look at it from a different perspective in terms of local drivers, I think is a really useful and insightful lens to put on this. We are obviously going to be facing some very tough times. But thank you very, very much for an excellent presentation. And thank you to the participants for staying with us and for raising some really interesting questions. We hope you'll join us again at some more of these ERC online events. Good evening and take care, stay safe.